everybody. Thank you so much for coming on this lovely fall day. My name's Gary Seymour. I'm the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Our speaker today is Steve Simon, who's a professor of international relations at Colby College in Maine. Steve and I go way back in our careers. We both started in the government as junior staff civil servants in the State Department under President Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and then later we served together in the National Security Council in more senior positions under President Clinton and then President Obama. For most of that time, Steve focused on counterterrorism and U.S. Middle East policy, and I was focused on nuclear weapons proliferation. So thank goodness we didn't have to work together too often. But when we did work together, I really found Steve to be a model public servant with a really keen intelligence and substantive knowledge, the integrity to tell truth to our political masters, and fortunately a very dry wit, which always makes working together easier. So when you think of Steve, think of somebody like Bill Taylor, who just testified yesterday about his experiences as U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Outside government, Steve has been incredibly prolific as an author of books, articles, reports, op-eds on a range of subjects, including Palestine, counterterrorism strategy, the theological roots of Islamic terrorism, U.S.-Israeli relations, U.S. military presence in Iraq, and averting war between the U.S. and Iran, to name just a few. I don't know how you have found the time to be so prolific. He's currently working on a new book that looks at the history of U.S. policy in the Middle East since President Reagan, so I encourage all of you to keep an eye out for that when it's published. So Steve is the epitome of the hyphenated civil servant scholar. It's not quite as sexy as soldier scholar and diplomat scholar, no. But I think it's a very important career to marry knowledge of public policy making with substance and expertise. His topic today is the U.S. and the Middle East in the Age of Trump, which is based on a New York Review of Books article that will be coming out very soon. Steve will, talk about the main issues that he wants to discuss with President Trump, and then we'll have time for discussion and for Q&A. I want to let everybody know that we're recording this session, so we can post it on our website. So just keep that in mind during the discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Steve.
Thank you, Gary, for that kind introduction. The thing about speaking truth to power is that it's easy when nobody listens. There's really, there's no risk.
Although I'll say I know on at least one occasion when you risked physical abuse because you spoke. We won't mention any names, but sometimes it can be physically dangerous in addition to jeopardizing your career.
Yeah.
So maybe you were a soldier scholar after all.
There was a fist fight once between Rahm Emanuel and Tony Lake. I don't know if you witnessed that.
No, I wasn't.
Two Type A individuals, if there ever were any. Okay, so my plan really is just to read this, sort of slowly, and invite comments. I might actually interrupt myself occasionally to put a gloss on, on one judgment or another. But just a fair warning. So, and I won't be offended if anybody's forehead hits the table during this presentation. By the way, this is about Trump. in a significant way, but the focus really is on Iran, the United States, and Israel in that sort of Trumpian context, in the Trumpian universe. So the lesson will never begin. As the United States continues to withdraw from the Middle East, it leaves the competition between Israel and Iran unmediated and unresolved. The recession of U.S. power from the region began under Barack Obama, as the costs of a 37-year fantasy of American leadership could no longer be denied. When cognitive dissonance became unbearable, the media, Congress, and the White House began to converge on a new narrative. The United States, according to this narrative, was no longer as reliant on Middle East oil as it once was. The Arab Spring revolts, while inspiring admiration and hope, also clarified American irrelevance, or in the case of Libya, incompetence, and that Washington's long war over the fate of Iraq, and relatedly jihadism, has done more harm than good. As this revisionism gained traction, appetite for intervention faded. The emergence of new foes, a resurgent Russia and thrusting China, suggested that the focus of U.S. military power and diplomatic energy in the Middle East was misplaced. The Obama administration made this reassessment public by signaling a strategic pivot toward Asia. This was soon rebranded as rebalancing, as Middle Eastern and European allies noted that a pivot necessarily entailed a turning of America's back on their respective regions. In fact, no such complete rejection had been contemplated by the administration, but that was not the message as received. With the sordid conclusion of the NATO overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and subsequent massacre of U.S. personnel in Benghazi, the bloom was off the rose of liberal interventionism, which had inexplicably survived the George W. Bush administration's bloody attempt to recreate Iraq, and then only to blossom briefly again in Obama's first term. It is scarcely surprising, therefore, that in endorsing Bashar al-Assad's removal from power in mid-2011, Obama warned that the United States, he said, cannot and will not impose this transition upon Syria. It is up to the Syrian people to choose their own leaders, and we have heard their strong desire that there not be foreign intervention in their movement. What the United States will support is an effort to bring about a Syria that is democratic, just, and inclusive for all Syrians. We will support this outcome by pressuring Assad to get out of the way of this transition and standing up for the universal rights of the Syrian people, along with others in the international community. Now, this was more cautious than, say, George H.W. Bush in 1991, who said at an arms manufacturing plant in February of that year that the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people should take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside, while the U.S. rained down leaflets urging Iraqis to, quote, fill the streets and alleys and bring down Saddam Hussein and his aides, unquote. At the time, his administration had no intention, let alone a plan, to help Iraqis carry out such an insurrection, and when it came, Bush limply explained that, well, to intervene would bog the U.S. down in another Vietnam. In both cases, the would-be rebels drew selectively from American statements while failing to infer the most likely course of U.S. policy from the administration's revealed preferences. In each case, the outcome was catastrophic for those waiting for a salvific America. Syrian Kurds are now sipping from the same bitter chalice. In this instance, the circumstances were complicated by a paradoxical perception of President Trump both within the U.S. government and among foreign parties. On the one hand, Trump is seen as omnipotent. On the other, as a blowhard to be disregarded. In the absence of a policy coordination mechanism in Washington, a function generally performed by the National Security Council and its staff, this sort of confusion about the role and relevance of the West Wing can cause real problems. Thus, U.S. Central Command, in sync with then Defense Secretary James R. Mattis, continuously assured their Kurdish comrades that the United States would never let them down. Given Trump's own clearly expressed desire to withdraw from Syria, these blandishments amounted to whistling past the graveyard. Trump, after all, had already ordered U.S. troops out of Syria in December 2018. The wall-to-wall pushback in Washington at that moment reflected the success of decades of Kurdish lobbying, their role as combatants in the war against ISIS, and lingering American guilt over the betrayal of Iraqi Kurds decades before. Trump retreated, but just for the moment, pausing only to get rid of Mattis and H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor. It turned out that Trump's views actually mattered, and that he can and does often get his way. The Kurds did not have to be left swinging in the breeze. There were alternatives, chiefly a Kurdish-Syrian deal, brokered or possibly guaranteed by Russia, that would have extended Syrian authority to the SDF-controlled areas of the country and increased Turkish confidence in their security, which they believed to be compromised by the intimacy of U.S. and Kurdish ties. Brett McGurk, the former U.S. coordinator of the anti-ISIS campaign, had tried to nudge U.S. policy in this direction, but in the absence of a functioning interagency process, there was no procedural way to reconcile the conflicting objectives of safeguarding Kurds, attending to the needs of a treaty ally, and isolating the Syrian regime. Just as the prospect of hanging concentrates the mind, Jim Jeffrey, the special envoy for Syria, has been thrashing around trying to stem the Turkish tide, which has just engulfed the Kurdish city of Rosaline and could swamp a larger area than the 30-kilometer deep, 444-kilometer long stretch of territory that Turkey initially specified. A ceasefire agreement obtained by Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo in a meeting with Erdogan on October 16th was meant to allow Kurdish forces to get out of the Turks' way, but it appears that Turkish troops are maneuvering to block their escape and create a kill zone. The Turkish-Russian agreement reached at Sochi the other day, and about which President Trump is speaking today to take credit for it, which I suppose he can do in a sort of a grimly logical way, having started the whole thing, will seal the overall deal. Now, as dramatic as these developments are, they are just one half of a double feature. The other being Iran's reply to Trump's campaign of maximum pressure and its implications for Israel. Like Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, Trump came into office seemingly determined to humble an Iran that had allegedly been enriched and emboldened by his immediate predecessor. To the extent there was a discernible pattern preceding Trump, both Clinton and Obama left office attempting to fashion a working relationship with the Iranian regime. Bush, in contrast, that is Bush 1, in contrast, cooperated with Tehran in Afghanistan, but was then bled by Iran, having brought a large army to Iran's border amid sloganeering about how real men go to Tehran and the road to Tehran runs through Baghdad. Until recently, it looked as though Trump would depart from this pattern and leave office as committed to weakening Iran as he was when he entered it. And he had been quite tough. As early as April 2017, Trump declared that Iran was not living up to the quote-unquote spirit of the nuclear deal, as though 159 pages of mind-numbing technical detail could be said to have a spirit, and that Iran's compliance with the deal was, in effect, not in its spirit, insofar as compliance yielded the resources Tehran needed to expand its regional influence. Hence, to obey the letter of the agreement was to violate its spirit. Trump then withdrew from the deal, as you all probably remember, and ended waivers of sanctions on oil sales and other transactions. The maximum pressure policy was effective in imposing serious penalties on Iran. The United States is a financial hegemon, owing to the reserve status of the dollar, administration of the SWIFT system, and the pivotal role of the Federal Reserve in clearing dollar-denominated transactions. If the United States decides to wreck a foreign economy, it is positioned to do so. Since the U.S. reimposition of sanctions on Iran was unilateral, however, the effect was bound to be partial at best. Secondary sanctions were therefore levied against other countries whose firms did business with Iran as a way to compel cooperation with a sanctions policy that third countries, especially signatories to the nuclear deal, considered illegitimate. Coercion, however, spurs resentment. European countries established a mechanism, INSTEX, to facilitate transactions with Iran that avoided the U.S. banking system, while at the same time agitating against Trump's maximum pressure policy. The Chinese offered Iran $400 billion in investment and took delivery of Iranian oil. The Russians, themselves under U.S. sanctions, dismissed Washington's threats. The Germans and French cast about for ways to salvage the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action via a new round of negotiations that might take into account collateral issues that had vexed the United States, while Britain, the Trump administration's only sort of friend on this issue, lost whatever influence it might have had in European capitals by dropping out of the EU. In the meantime, having stuck to its obligations under the JCPOA for 2 years following the U.S. withdrawal, Iran had systematically reinforced international support for its position. It then capitalized on its good behavior by leveraging its record of cooperation through measured threats to reduce it. Iran, having gotten European and Japanese attention, proceeded to up the ante by attacking or seizing tankers ferrying oil from the Arab side of the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz into the Indian Ocean. Iranian fire also downed a $220 million global Sentinel remotely piloted vehicle, a drone. The initial U.S. response to that was to threaten the use of force. The current U.S. commander of Central Command, that is the U.S. Middle Eastern Command, General Frank McKenzie, ordered a surge of U.S. aircraft into the region in preparation of cruise missiles to pummel the bases from which the Iranian provocations had been staged. With John Bolton, a longtime hardliner in Iran, then next door to the Oval Office, it was widely assumed that the U.S. and Iran would soon be at war. The response never took place. Trump was already rethinking his policy toward Iran, perhaps sensing that maximum pressure was not going to get maximum cooperation. He was already turning away from Bolton, who he perceived as someone likely to get him into a war he did not wish to fight. Deftly mangling a commonplace idiom and revealing his unfamiliarity with firearms, Trump declared that he had been, quote-unquote, cocked and loaded, but decided to pull the raiders back just before they hit their targets. His explanation that the triggering event, the downing of the U.S. drone, was trivial, and that a strike would have killed 150 Iranians, failed to satisfy, even though one might agree with the prudence of the decision and the disproportionate toll that would have been exacted for the destruction of an unmanned vehicle. It left open the question, however, of whether the decision signified a new U.S. strategy toward Iran. The answer was not long in coming. On September 14, 2019, Iran launched an attack against two giant Aramco installations in Saudi Arabia. Analysis of the satellite images of the Abqaiq facility, one of the facilities that was attacked, before and after the attacks, appeared to show 19 individual strikes, 14 that punctured storage tanks, 3 that disabled oil processing trains, and 2 that failed to inflict any damage. The weapons used have not yet been identified. The UN is investigating this now, but they appear to have been drones, cruise missiles, or both. Either platform can be maneuvered while in flight, so the direction from which they struck their targets would not necessarily indicate their launch points. But the consensus, despite the Iranian foreign minister's calm denials, is that the attack originated from Iranian bases. The United States claims to have overhead imagery, satellite photography, of preparations for the attack at an Iranian airbase. The attack instantly reduced Saudi exports by half and set in motion a repair effort that was expected to take months. The markets, after some initial jitteriness, settled down in part because the Saudis immediately announced the use of its substantial emergency reserve, and in part because the fight did not intensify. Although the Trump administration had talked in tough terms about Iran and submitted unprecedentedly large defense budget requests to Congress, Trump himself showed little appetite for combat. This was a striking and indicative development. Saudi Arabia had courted Trump from the beginning of his presidency, while the United Arab Emirates got an earlier start by meeting with Trump associates in the Maldives before the inauguration. Trump's first foreign trip as president was to Saudi Arabia, where he was accorded a reception that combined Gilbert and Sullivan with Game of Thrones. Mohammed bin Salman, the kingdom's de facto ruler, had consulted privately with Jared Kushner before initiating the coup that consolidated his power and secured the administration's embrace after the CIA had confirmed that Mohammed bin Salman had ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident and Washington Post columnist. Now, Iran, the nemesis of both the US and Saudi Arabia, had disabled the engine of the global economy, struck the territory of an ally of the US, albeit an informal one. Yet here was the president brushing off the attack as both trivial and of concern solely to the direct victim of the attack. Now, it's worth noting here that Iran's provocation was predictable. In the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration was impelled by Congress to pursue its own version of a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, including the extraterritorialization of sanctions. Tehran tolerated this initiative only up to the point at which it responded by attacking a US Air Force facility at Al-Khubar in Saudi Arabia. The parallels between then and now are inescapable. There is, of course, the major difference in the choice of target. In the present instance, no Americans were killed. In the 1990s attack, 19 US personnel were killed. In the present, Iran's objectives, however, were the same in both instances. In one swift maneuver, Iran demonstrated Saudi vulnerability, the kingdom's inability to protect itself, and the US inability to protect it, while forcing Washington to choose between retreat and escalation. Then, as now, the US chose not to retaliate. The Saudis opted to parley with Iran rather than suffer the consequences of a spiraling squabble with Iran. The Iranian stratagem was risky, but proved to be well judged. With US acquiescence in Iranian aggression against a nominally powerful Arab state, one closely linked to the United States and which played a pivotal role in the global economy, the subsequent move toward Arab-Iranian détente, followed quickly by Washington's abandonment of its Kurdish co-combatants in the war against ISIS, showed that the regional policies that regulated U.S. involvement in the region in the past were clearly mutating. If there were any doubt, it should have been resolved by Trump's pursuit of a meeting in New York with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who rebuffed the overture, I might add. Now, this should not come as a shock. The midpoint in an administration's first term is generally a time for stock-taking and course correction. It's a moment when the realization dawns on the president, excuse me, it's a realization dawns on the president that the campaign fetishes that drove policy at the outset of his administration were unmoored from secular realities and have driven him into a cul-de-sac. There were such moments in the George W. Bush presidency, if perhaps closer to the end of his first term, in the Clinton administration, and most notably in the Obama administration, thank you, following the Libya debacle and an imploded Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Often these shifts are marked by the departure of officials who championed policies that, in the president's perceptions, had not quite worked out. In this case, they're all gone. Mattis, Bolton, McMaster, among other lesser lights. Trump, at last, is unconfined. The contours of Trump's preferred approach are not unlike his predecessors. The Arab-Israeli peace process is seen as a dead end. The difference between the two administrations relates primarily to the perceived domestic political value of catering to Likud aspirations. Both presidents rejected the endless war paradigm. Neither wished to be entangled in the Syrian civil war, although it is true that Obama hedged by approving a massive secret program to arm and train so-called moderate groups within the overall framework of the armed opposition. Both paid lip service to the more audacious plans advanced by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but declined to follow through. Both wanted to flee Afghanistan. Here again, Obama hedged, apparently against his better judgment. Trump has not. And despite the Obama administration's sincere support for the Arab Spring revolutions, there was not much it could do to advance them. Trump has gone further by deriding the spirit that animated the rebellions. On one level, both Obama and Trump appear to be highly idiosyncratic presidents and are obviously dissimilar in temperament, values, and intellectual capacity. On another level, though, they both reflect a declining sense of the utility, purpose, and effectuality of American engagement, and especially of military intervention in the greater Middle East. Neither is or was motivated to enter a bidding war with Iran, Russia, or in recent weeks Turkey, for control of territory that they assess to be of little relevance to U.S. core interests, or, in the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE, where the U.S. is likely to enjoy preponderant influence without going to war for it. In this respect, they and the societal preferences they represent are merely reverting to the historical norm that prevailed between the conclusion of the Algerine War in 1815 and the formation of the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force in 1980. Until now, it was unclear whether the Obama administration was a fluke or the harbinger of a trend. Trump's rhetoric and actions point in the latter direction. Okay. So where's all this going? Well, the evolution of American interest in the region has been unsettling for Israel. Unlike the Arab Gulf states with which Israel has low-key or clandestine ties and which no longer pose a conventional military threat, Israel does not have the option of détente with Iran. Although there is an ongoing legitimate debate about the relationship between the disconcertingly radical way Iran speaks about Israel, replete with threats to obliterate it, and actual Iranian intentions, there's no mistaking a persistent Iranian effort to position itself to attack Israel. Iran's posture recalls the earlier campaign of Arab states bordering on Israel and of the pre-Oslo Palestinian strategy toward Israel. In that bygone era, it was to maintain pressure, accept defeat in war without conceding defeat, and prepare for the next round. Each cycle was presumed to chip away at Israel's resolve, self-confidence, and ultimately its capacity for self-defense. The The objective was not victory in the short term, which was seen as unlikely, but over the long haul. Israel's costly victory in the 1973 war, the peace with Egypt in 79 and Jordan in 94, coupled with the collapse in 89 of Syria's Soviet armorer and bankroller, buried this Arab strategy. The so-called first-tier states eventually absorbed the enduring fact of their military inferiority and accepted Israel's presence in the Middle East. Just as the old Arab strategy was fading, the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran gave it a new lease on life. The Iranians have actualized the strategy through their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, where in effect Iran now shares a border with Israel, and support for terrorist groups and the Palestinian rejectionist movement, Hamas. Ideology drives Iran's opposition to Israel, in my judgment anyway. For the regime, Israel's existence is an affront to the moral order that, in its view, should govern the universe, or at least the regional structure of interstate relations. Whether or not this revolutionary commitment to restoring a divinely ordained status quo ante is shared by many or even most Iranians is, if not irrelevant, then of small significance. This has placed Israel in an awkward position in that it perceives that adjustments to its foreign policy or plausible concessions of any kind would not address the underlying drivers of Iranian hostility. The ideological dimension of Iranian foreign policy toward Israel naturally heightens its anxiety regarding Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. Now, for some Israelis, it suggests that deterrence, the dynamic of mutual terror that made nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union unlikely, if still possible, would not apply to a nuclear standoff between Israel and Iran. Others point to the highly ideological nature of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry to argue that, at the end of the day, deterrence prevailed despite the fierce commitment of both sides to their respective worldviews and the existential imperative of victory. The Iranians tend to talk about this in ways that stoke Israeli fears, emphasizing, for example, that while Iran could withstand a nuclear assault and survive as a nation and state, Israel would be decimated by a single weapon. Now, while it's true that Mao said much the same thing about the U.S. and Chinese balance in 1958, in fact, almost exactly the same thing. When China actually possessed a nuclear capability, both countries seem to have survived to fight a trade war 60 years later. But you could still understand why this would make the Israelis a bit nervous. Anyway, the JCPOA signed in 2015 had promised to sheath this sword of Damocles for upwards of 15 years, and it might still. But the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement and maximum pressure campaign have disincentivized Iranian participation. U.S. policy has also boosted popular skepticism among Iranians about the deal, which in turn complicates the ability of its protagonists to keep the JCPOA alive, let alone enter into a new round of negotiations. For the moment, however, Iran remains largely in compliance with the deal. Broadly speaking, Israelis who evince confidence in deterrence, Israel is thought to have 65 to 85 nuclear warheads deliverable by missile, plane, or submarine. They believe that the JCPOA was a step in the right direction. Those who doubt that Iran is deterrable believe the deal was a disaster and that whatever can be done to disarm Iran must be done. This argument will probably permeate Israeli decision-making as long as Iran is ruled by clerics and the Revolutionary Guard. I'm going to close with a few words about Israel's defense doctrine and why I think this is headed in a hazardous direction. Israel's defense doctrine, formulated by its first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, was geared to the kind of long war that its Arab adversaries envisaged. Israel faced serious disadvantages in this conflict. Compared to the Arab states at war with it, Israel was poor, sparsely populated, lacked defensible borders, strategic depth, and in the 1950s, a reliable source of heavy weapons, armor, and aircraft. Ben-Gurion identified several pillars, strategic pillars to offset these liabilities. Deterrence, early warning, and military decision, and on a defense strategy to be executed offensively by transferring the battle to the enemy's territory. Military decision is just, it's a technical term for, winning the fight convincingly. Really knocking the other guy out of the ring. Now, these were interdependent aims. Deterrence, for example, hinged on military decision. That is, achieving a military decision based on the defeat of the enemy's army in battle was crucial in deterring renewed attack. An early warning, advance notice of the enemy's intention to attack, was essential to military decision because it enabled Israel to strike first or parry the enemy's initial thrust. This, in turn, was essential to transferring the battle to enemy soil, a necessity given Israel's dearth of strategic depth, owing to its extremely narrow waist. There was no hinterland to which defenders could withdraw. This, of course, changed, for a time at least, after '67, but Israel's settlement program, in effect, erased this advantage by transforming what had been strategic depth into vulnerable home ground. This explains wall-to-wall support in Israel for annexation of the Jordan River Valley. Having settled scattered bits of the West Bank, Israel's need for strategic depth must now be met farther east by the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Ben-Gurion thought that Arab rejection of Israel would last for a century or even longer. During this long war, Israel would need to cultivate a great power backer, develop its economy, and acquire the ultimate deterrent in the form of nuclear weapons. In the conventional military sphere, the deterrent effect of military decision would lengthen the time between wars, both by diminishing the enemy's combat capability, which would have to be rebuilt, and by denying the enemy its strategic objective. Against Palestinian guerrillas, the strategy was somewhat different. In that case, deterrence would be achieved through disproportionate punishment, which is still sort of the Israeli mindset in dealing with Palestinians, at least in my experience in government. In each arena, the deterrent effects were going to be cumulative. That was the idea. This strategy has now been upended by Iran. Ben-Gurion's vision was already showing signs of wear. In none of its recent wars has Israel been able to force a military decision. In theory, of course, it could do so against, say, Hezbollah or Hamas. In practice, though, a military decision would be a Pyrrhic one, isolating Israel diplomatically and imposing severe economic costs on itself. Against Iran, however, there is not even the theoretical possibility of a military decision. Iran is simply too big and too far away. The other factor that has eroded Ben-Gurion's strategy is the emergence of precision-guided weapons in the armories of otherwise weak states, or in the possession of entities that are not even states, such as Iran's Hezbollah ally in Lebanon. Israel has faced a similar threat for over a decade in the form of Hezbollah's inventory of less than precise missiles and rockets. This inventory, as you all probably know, includes over 100,000 such weapons deployed in private homes and civilian installations, including schools and hospitals. At this stage, it is estimated that a small percentage of the total were fabricated as precision weapons or converted to serve that role. An assault incorporating barrages of these missiles could conceivably target airports, military facilities, communications and energy grids, hospitals, ports, with a degree of accuracy that has not been possible until now. The Iranian strike against the Aramco facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais has demonstrated that these standoff weapons are now capable, even when used by third-rate military powers. Anarchic conditions in Syria have simultaneously afforded Iran the opportunity to introduce this capability closer to the Israeli border and given Israel nearly free rein to interdict the transport of these weapons and strike bases and depots where they are stored. Here's the punchline. The new dispensation has produced a revised Israeli security strategy known as the Campaign Between the Wars, or its Hebrew acronym, MABAM. According to its originator, the former Israeli Army Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot, the assumption of Israel's classic defense strategy that military decision was key to deterrence could no longer be relied upon either to deter Israel's foes or delay their decision to renew hostilities. In this view, there was no longer the option of simply waiting until the next war. Deterrence, he argued, must constantly be reinforced between major wars through continuous attacks meant to grind down the enemy's capabilities and push the moment the enemy feels ready for another round farther out into the future. War would, of course, be inevitable, but the interregnum between wars would be lengthened. This would buy time for the development of innovative military capabilities and, in the best of all worlds, diplomatic progress. This strategy might best be described as permanent offensive. So what does this mean as a practical matter? In operational terms, this strategy has generated at least 158 strikes against targets in Syria since 2013, in which about 2,000 missiles and bombs were delivered by Israeli airplanes. The number could well be higher, much higher in fact. The geographical spread of the Israeli campaign has encompassed targets as far as Beirut and the Bekaa in Lebanon to the northwest, Atemf and Bukamal on the Iraqi-Jordanian border, and against Anbar province in Iraq in attacks apparently staged from a base in northeastern Syria. Given that the U.S. controls Iraqi airspace, the U.S. evidently decided that catering to Israel's campaign plans outweighed its interest in Iraqi stability. Israel has also joined the Saudi coalition against the Houthis in Yemen. And now, some of this is not entirely new. The Israelis have conducted long-range operations before, a hostage rescue in Entebbe in 1976, an attack against the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 81, the destruction of Syria's unfinished reactor in 2007, and lethal operations within Iran and Europe. But the current pattern established under this Mabam doctrine is, as the name indicates, a coordinated campaign of growing reach and audacity. Although not construed as part of this campaign, and probably driven as much by politics as security, open discussion of territorial annexation during Israel's election campaign is consistent with the thrust of the new strategy and has been endorsed by former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, the leader of Blue-White, who just received the mandate to form a government from the Israeli president, Reuven Rivlin. Despite Israel's ability to project power regionally, it's not an entirely free actor. Russia is not necessarily happy with this. Now, astute observers, Israeli observers, recognize that Mabam carries considerable risk for Israel. There's the risk of escalation should Tehran decide to respond and proceed somewhat more effectively than it has in the past, perhaps killing Israeli civilians in the process, necessitating an Israeli response that then escalates in unforeseen ways. In this event, the very missile capabilities targeted under the Mabam doctrine morph from a potential threat to a disaster, possibly very quickly. This is a dilemma often faced by policymakers. Gary will know this quite well. Will the step I take next provoke the very attack I am seeking to deter? And there is the danger of alienating the United States by destabilizing a country in which the U.S. has invested a great deal of blood and treasure, like Iraq, or dragging the U.S. into a regional war with Israel that would not serve its interests. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Very simply, this is the reason. Even in the most optimistic scenario where Turkey halts its offensive in Syria, the Syrian state, minus the regime, re-enters the areas of Syria currently held by Turkey and the SDF, the U.S. withdraws its troops from Syria's oil fields, and the U.S. and Iran re-enter negotiations on the nuclear issue. Israel and Iran will remain in a face-off, deploying remarkably similar strategies that are prone to unexpected, swift escalation. The U.S. withdrawal now on display, rationalized in Trump's tweets, whose essence is not categorically different from Obama's more discursive 2016 interview in The Atlantic, may not be irreversible, but it will likely last for a while. From an Israeli perspective, this means it is being left to battle Iran alone. Although experienced American voices would rightly dispute this judgment, Israel's deep aversion to risk will lead them to discount such assurances. And one thing the U.S. has learned, certainly since 1967, is that when Israel feels alone, it is liable to act alone. That's it.
That's an ominous ending. So I think, let me ask the first question, then I'll ask others. I mean, you do a good job of portraying the Trump administration's Middle East policy as a combination of continuity, of structural factors, like a Middle East fatigue with military intervention and coercive diplomacy with Iran, which other presidents have pursued, But in the case of the Trump administration, it has some idiosyncratic, very particular elements, including, I would say, utter ineptitude and ignorance, and a president who may not be completely sane. So when you put those two together, you have an amplification of the structural factors, and therefore more risk and chaos. Because there would be a way for the U.S. to disengage, but this goes back to the Israel question. I'll put it as the form of a question. Is there a way for the U.S. to disengage from military intervention and presence in the region, which I think is actually politically popular, but do it in a way that's more responsible and doesn't, in your argument, increase the risk that Israel will feel it has to act alone because it is alone? Or other countries like the Saudis or the Emiratis, because they can no longer depend on the U.S. They have to take their own actions.
You know, your description of Trump reminded me of one of the reasons you were so effective as a briefer in government. It's your capacity for understatement. Yeah, it is pretty bad, and you know, it all could be done better, but you know, in a very polarized environment, you know, it's hard. It's really hard to do. And I'm going to take your question in a teeny bit of a different direction. Yeah, I think, you know, politically withdrawal, let me rephrase, as a matter of popular opinion, withdrawal is increasingly compelling and people want it. And this is one of the reasons that Trump is all for it. It has some political utility. But within Washington, it's difficult to get there because, well, for two reasons. One is that my sense is in Washington, people still haven't met a war they didn't like. You know, intervention is, you know, is habit forming in a way. And, you know, when it's framed in existential terms, so for example, the way in which the implications of the U.S. withdrawal in Syria for the ISIS threat was framed. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, I mean, I'm just one guy, I'm a minority of one, and I'm not worried about ISIS, you know, showing up at midnight and stealing my lawn furniture, you know. It's like, it's a local problem, and it's a serious local problem, that's true. It's secondarily a problem, you know, let's say for the Europeans, and, you know, the British seem very vexed about it, but, you know, Britain has 15 deployable combat brigades. I mean, they could do something about it if they wanted to. You know, the French have an expeditionary military as well. You know, they could do something. But, you know, the fact is, for them, there are other less cost ways of dealing, you know, with an ISIS threat that has kind of sort of affected them. We don't, Trump, you know, is sort of right about, you know, ISIS not being really a big issue. But once the issue is framed in terms of ISIS, then all of a sudden you get a bipartisan convergence on the need or the imperative of intervention, because the Democrats are already looking at 2020, and you know, they don't want to be caught short and being accused of not, you know, somehow not being as robust on national security as the Republicans. And the Republicans, in part because taking a stand on, you know, Turkey and ISIS, that's contrary to the president, doesn't threaten them with a primary challenge, have gone overboard in criticizing White House decision-making on this and fretting about ISIS and Kurdish allies and so forth. So there's a bit of a disjunction, I think, between the popularity of withdrawal and the political environment, in which in which it can be done. The second, part of the answer to your question, which we can talk about more, if people wish, is that when the decision-making system in Washington is badly broken, and you have a government apparatus that, whose strategic, tendencies, preferences, are completely at odds with those of the president. And those differences are unmediated, in part because there's no system. And now, Jim Jeffrey, who's the U.S. Special Envoy, conceded in testimony yesterday that no one had told him that the administration had decided to withdraw. No one told him. And because there was no communication between the government apparatus and the White House in the preceding year, the CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, had spent a year lying to the Kurds, and U.S. European Command had spent a year lying to the Turks, because neither of them, had any notion of what was actually happening within the president's brain. Maybe that's too strong a word for the ganglion that that produces those impulses, but there it is, completely broken process, and the broken process is itself a reflection of the president's broken character.
But that's another interesting similarity between Obama and Trump, is that in both cases, their Middle East policy was opposed by the establishment, or the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, who still believe in U.S. primacy in the Middle East, achieved through military intervention.
Absolutely true. And the leadership thing is very seductive. And people do want to believe it. And in the region, if you talk about the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, or Israel for that matter, there's a clamoring for American leadership. But American leadership is defined by them as the United States subordinating its interest to theirs. So show your leadership by doing what it is I want you to do, even though it doesn't serve your interest.
Yes, Arash?
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about knowledge production, or just kind of definitional premises. So as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, international relations as a subfield assumes a world that's comprised of autonomous nation states. And I was thinking of that when you mentioned that the U.S. is a hegemon capable of wreaking havoc in a foreign economy, which would then suggest that not all states are equal, self-determined, or autonomous. So then I thought, I had a basic question about your initial premise. What exactly do you mean by withdrawal and intervention in light of the point that you made about the U.S. having the capability as a hegemon to wreck a foreign economy?
Okay, so first, I was referring to the United States as a financial hegemon. So the United States can inflict serious damage on a country's economy if it chooses to do so. Now, that may change over time as resistance grows to the U.S. use of its economic power, its hegemonic power in that domain. That could well happen, and that you could see some cracks in the wall, but it's hard to know whether those cracks will deepen or widen. In terms of military intervention, it is true that U.S. military interventions have been successful in their proximate objectives. So in 1991, the United States succeeded in pushing 150,000 Iraqis out of Kuwait in 100 hours, and destroying several Iraqi divisions in the process. That was pretty expeditious. Now, it took a full 6 months to prepare, for the war. And the United States at that moment had no conflicting challenges, no other challenges it needed to deal with. I mean, Saddam's timing was kind of weird because he chose to start a war that would involve the United States when the U.S. had an army in Germany that was formed and equipped to defeat the Soviet Union, all dressed up with nowhere to go. So, in 6 months, a good part of that army was transferred, to the Middle East and crushed. So that was great. But then the United States found itself ultimately incapable of enforcing the ceasefire terms that ended the war. So proximate objective achieved, but the longer term objectives as set, for the war aims were left unachieved. In 2003, the United States had no problem bumping off Saddam Hussein. U.S. forces did it very quickly, but then controlling Iraq, proved to be very nearly impossible. So, that.
Same with Libya.
And Libya. Well, you see, this is interesting because Libya was a bit of a mixed case, because it was one where the United States decided, okay, we will provide targeting guidance for Europeans, and they will actually do the shooting. Now, at the beginning of the war, it didn't work out that way because, the start of the war was announced, and then the Europeans couldn't find the keys to the airplanes. They forgot where they parked them. So it took them a while to get their pants up, and so the United States flew some strike missions, at the outset. But it was all kept very limited because of the War Powers Resolution and the administration's unwillingness to get, to report to the Congress under the War Powers Resolution. After that, we're only talking about a U.S. drone, flying over Libya, pointing out targets, mostly to Norwegian airplanes, because the air war was fought primarily by the Norwegian Air Force with 12 airplanes. They flew, something like 20% of the strike missions. And then the war came to an end, only by luck, because the Europeans had run out of ammunition by then, and parliaments were not appropriating more money for munitions. So it actually looked for a moment that, Gaddafi was going to survive. And the United States, when to speed things up, when the United States was asked to provide a second drone, to orbit, because Gaddafi had all these chemical weapons down south at Wadan, and so we needed a drone to sort of do orbit over that to make sure that the site wasn't compromised. We didn't have a second drone. I mean, ultimately, we took one off the training line at Fort Huachuca. I mean, that's not what you call overwhelming power. It was really. It was really problematic. But suffice it to say, it's difficult, for the United States. It's difficult for the United States in Afghanistan. You look at what happened there, and there was a big surge, a serious surge under Obama, which Bob Woodward describes very nicely in his book on Obama's first term. Obama was railroaded into doing that, by the combination of Gates and Clinton, and later railroading into acting in Syria by Clinton and Panetta, Secretary of Defense. Panetta. I mean, in some ways, Obama was not a very strong leader, in that.
I mean, it's not politically correct to say it, but in some ways, Trump is a more powerful leader because he's prepared to act against the advice of all of his top people. Obama was much more, you could say, responsible if you wanted to be polite, or you could say he was much more malleable, much less willing to resist, the impulse, although finally by the end, in the case of Syria, he did reject the combined recommendations of his head of CIA, State Department Defense.
Well, in Syria, I think he decided fairly early on that the United States would not intervene in an overt military way. And he was persuaded, let's put it that way, a couple of years afterward to intervene differently in a way that we can't talk about in detail here. But it's in the newspapers. You can read all about it, folks. It was a fairly robust program.
David?
Thank you for this. I liked your careful wording of the U.S. abandonment of the Syrian Kurds, our Kurdish co-combatants. You were very careful not to say the Kurds, which I think a lot of people are missing these days, right? The YPG are not the Kurds. They happen to be Kurdish, but they're not the Kurds. Behind closed doors, there's people in Dohuk and Howler who are not sad to see some Kurdish competitors go by the wayside. But I recently came back from a talk at Stanford conference where I was on a panel with Brett McGurk and Colin Call. And Colin has an argument not dissimilar from yours, where he sees a shift in grain strategy over time. He describes Bush as onshore hegemony, Obama as offshore balancing, and as Trump as offshore hegemony, right? Maximalist goals and minimalist commitments, right? A real hesitancy to U.S. force. But there is still a sense of withdrawal there. So I wanted to push you on this. The U.S. military is traditionally the tripwire, right? What are the tripwires of the 21st century? If the U.S. wants to commit to a place credibly into a group but doesn't want to deploy U.S. forces, what options do they have? Right? The obvious ones are universities, not American universities like AUB.
Where the obvious ones are.
If I was an advisor to the Syrian Kurds, my advice was don't ask for 100 U.S. troops to stay in Kobani and protect you. Get the University of Kentucky to open a campus in Kobani immediately. Right? That would have been the best guarantor of the Kurds remaining there. And so I'm wondering, what other tools does the U.S. have nowadays, other than military, to actually commit to a place and to set up a tripwire, basically, to prevent the sort of things that we saw in northeast Syria?
That's a really interesting question. I don't mean that in the British sense of interesting, in the American sense. If you look at, say, UAE, they've cottoned onto this, quite nicely, because, they had looked at the congressional response to the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, and the very close vote. I mean, it was, I think, in the Senate, the edge was four votes. Okay, I mean, and it wasn't really very encouraging in the House, either. It was a close one thing. Because who likes Kuwaitis? So the UAE looked at that and they sort of said, well, if something happens to us, we don't want the same reaction in Congress. So they got in NYU and they brought in the Louvre and in recognizing that, and they brought in the Guggenheim.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and the Guggenheim, you see, is filled with pictures of nude women, and it has a Jewish name. So, what better, a tripwire are you actually going to have?
Trump Tower.
Exactly. No, I think, no, Trump would be able to write it off as a loss. Most of these things are unprofitable. He'd do better if the Iranians, if it was an infinite dynamic sink for Iranian cruise missiles. So, I think, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, right now there's a U.S. tripwire in just one place, and that's Korea. I can't think of...
Europe.
Or
Europe. We have
Oh,
troops
yeah,
in
Yeah, we do. I don't think of them as a tripwire, really. I think of them as actually a combat force.
Think
but-
creative, like non-military, right? A Google data center, right? That's a 21st century tripwire.
Yeah, I think this is good, but the problem is that the problem is not so much what your tripwire consists of, how it's configured, or what it looks like, but whether you're really prepared to be tripped, by the wire, and that's something, except in rare cases, you just don't know in advance. You just don't know until the moment. And, so tripwires from that perspective, are really dangerous. And I think, most governments or most national security decision makers would really want to avoid them.
Nader?
Your basic argument is that U.S. has been disengaging from Middle East in recent decades, but I'd like to ask you whether the entry of Russia and the cooperation of Russia and China in one entering militarily, one economically, might lead to a change in U.S. position, and I give you 3 recent events that are developing. Obviously, the withdrawal of U.S. forces in Russia, in Syria, allowed Russia to engage and assume an active role that increases its credibility. When Israelis attack targets in Iraq, one of the reactions in Iraq has been that Iran has tried to convince Iraqis to develop better relations with Russians and purchase S-400 from them. And we see that in past few weeks, after U.S. patriots were not able to protect oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, now Russia is actively engaging with the Saudis and saying we are willing to offer US-400 and willing to expand relations in all directions. Don't you think these might force the United States to engage in the region because of the global competition at the superpower level? Because Russia is now a rising power.
Yeah. Well, I was looking at the headline yesterday in the New York Times about the Turkey-Russia deal, and the headline was something like, the bylines I didn't recognize. I think they were more people who cover the Russia beat. But the headline was "Big Win, for Russia," and the first paragraph, it started off with, "Russian airplanes now patrol Syrian skies. Russia has now moved into territory abandoned or vacated by the United States." And there was a lot of heavy breathing, in that first paragraph. All of it suggesting that somehow Syria mattered to the United States. Like somehow the crown jewel of the American empire had been seized by the Klingons or something. And, and I kind of wondered about that when I read it, because I thought, okay, the United States did briefly consider, I guess in 1957, in Operation Straggle, consider intervening covertly in Syrian politics. But the Dulles brothers rejected the idea, even though at that time, the Soviet Union, which was poised to gain some advantage in Syria, was a strategic threat to the United States. But the decision was, something, this really wouldn't work. So let's just back off here. And I don't think that the situation really has fundamentally changed. In other words, since between then and now, the United States economy has been in no way dependent on Syria. The United States has few, if any, affinity groups in Syria, in the social sciences, sense of that term. The Syrians during the Cold War were, of course, on the other side, and the United States and Syria didn't have friendly relations. And Syria is still an adversary of, the United States' friend and ally in the region, Israel. So, I don't see the big stake that the U.S. is supposed to have in Syria, and therefore, I don't really see the premise of all that heavy breathing about losing out, to the Russians, at least in the Syrian context. In the Saudi context, which, is a little bit more interesting, it seems to me.
And just to add to your point, the Russians were already the dominant power in Syria.
Yeah.
And that happened under Obama. So Trump just gave them the last piece. I don't see it as a strategic shift.
No, and the thing is that when the Soviet Union existed, for a few years they ran out of cash. They maintained a big naval base in Tartus. They had intelligence gathering stations. There were literally tens of thousands of Russians that had served in Syria and had intermarried. They had Syrian wives. They had half Russian, half Syrian kids. It was a big deal, and it lasted for many, many years. Decades. So there was a connection between the Soviet Union and Syria that simply, wasn't going to exist in the case of the United States. On the Saudi side, it is a bit remarkable that the facility that everybody was talking about as, the throbbing ventricle of the global economy, the cracking facility at Abqaiq was essentially undefended. At a time of rising tensions. And, given the maximum pressure campaign, one would have anticipated, an Iranian response at some point, even if you didn't have the institutional memory to, recall Kobar and the 1996, attack there under similar circumstances. But it was essentially undefended. Can I explain that? Not really. The United States has been trying since the Reagan administration's NSDD, the National Security Directive 99, to persuade the Gulf states to install a coordinated, integrated air defense system. And that'll, it hasn't happened in 40 years, and it's not going to happen now. So it was undefended. Now, the Saudis will do what they normally do in this kind of a circumstance, which is make a big procurement, make a big acquisition of a weapons system that's supposed to protect them against threats. And the Soviets jumped in with one, and so maybe they'll buy it. Maybe they won't. But somehow it's hard for me to see Russia with its tiny, capital market, making any serious inroads in Saudi Arabia, and whatever price collusion they do, in the energy domain, is completely independent of, these other sort of more kinetic, things happening on the ground.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a naive question, just came to listen to your lecture. If you go back to before Trump abrogated the nuclear treaty with Iran, if you can assume that hadn't happened, would it have been possible to take a long view of our relationship with Iran and try to start building some kinds of programs with them, exchange programs with them, or anything else that you can think of, which in the long run could have stabilized the Middle East?
Well, that too is a good question. I mean, in 2008, way back when, the United States had actually begun to plan for some kind of consular presence, in Iran. And that fell through, I think, largely because the Iranians decided that they weren't interested. But the planning was Jeff and Philo Dibble,
Yeah.
right?
Under Madeline.
Yeah. That seemed to get some traction in Washington, but not in Iran. The JCPOA itself was, I can't speak, for then President Obama, but my sense was it was not a way to transform the world, but it was a way to solve a particular problem.
Or at least delay the problem.
And it's to manage a particular problem, okay, and a particular technical problem, in the sense that these arms control and non-proliferation agreements are ultimately technical, and it was important because the United States government, and you and I might disagree a bit. I'm not sure. The United States government has long privileged non-proliferation and arms control objectives over other foreign policy aims because the arms control and non-proliferation issues were seen to be somehow really profoundly strategic. And if you were going to deal with anything, you had to deal with those, because the consequences of something going wrong would be truly catastrophic, would be strategic. And sometimes that priority is misplaced, as it was, say, in the 1990s in Pakistan. That's sort of another story. But for the most part, it makes sense to me. So I think the Obama administration conformed to this general rule, and it was perceived to be particularly urgent because the Israelis were getting fairly torqued about it, and we're talking, I think, somewhat seriously about doing something about it on their own, which from a U.S. perspective would have been destabilizing and only reinforced, and would only reinforce Iranian determination to obtain, a nuclear weapon. So I think that was the thing, and it wasn't.
I'm not arguing that wasn't the thing. I'm asking the question: could that have been built upon in a different way?
Yeah. Well, I'm going there, but I'm taking the day off, so I'm taking my time. I have nowhere else to be. No, seriously, it might ultimately have led somewhere in the way that arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union did. We know, certainly in the Nixon administration, that Kissinger and his colleagues seriously disliked the Russians. Not just because of Russian policy predilections, but they were very difficult to work with. But you could argue, I think, that those arms control negotiations eventually got us to Helsinki. I think that would be the argument. So perhaps, there might have been a similar trajectory vis-a-vis Iran, but that's so speculative, I can't comment.
But just to add, if you don't mind, I'm very confident that if Clinton had won the election, there would have been an effort to negotiate follow-on agreements with Iran over missiles and Iranian activity in the region. Both Steve and I were on the campaign, so we're very aware that that's how people saw dealing with Iran as building on the nuclear deal to address other concerns. And in a funny way, that's where Trump is now, right? He wants to negotiate a new agreement that not only deals with the nuclear issue, but deals with these other elements of Iranian behavior. The problem is that Trump has gone about it in such an incompetent way that I think he's destroyed any chance of success. And that's my biggest beef with Trump is his incompetence more than anything else. Nagli.
Well, so thank you so much for this talk and conversation. Since at lunch you kept asking us about the future, when our fellows were talking about Lebanon and Jordan, I thought it would be fair to ask you about the future. And specifically, and it's not a very long future, I'm just thinking about the 2020 election. So I was wondering from your perspective, what are the foreign policy issues related to the Middle East that do matter? You mentioned that, Russia being in Syria doesn't matter. I beg to differ, only for the symbolic reason that Russia taking over Syria. But that's neither here nor there. So what are some of the foreign policy issues that you think are going to matter for the 2020 elections, and which of the 2,554 Democratic candidates do you think is in the best position to address them, at least from a campaign perspective?
Well, climate is, it's going to be big. It's a serious problem. And
But she's asking about Middle East foreign policy issues that relate to
yeah, oh, you're right. No,
You'll get there.
I heard you, and my answer
I'm
was
figuring you out.
deliberate.
That's your way of saying it's not going to be important.
I mean, compared, to Middle Eastern issues, the climate thing is, that's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, outside the door. And the U.S. Federal Reserve has now just published a study on the likely financial impact of climate change, and it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling that it comes from the Fed. So, I think, that'll be an issue. Now, to segue, climate change is going to be an issue for the Middle East, okay? The Northern Levant and the North African Rim and the Gulf are already heating up, and, owing to the feedback effects, involved in climate change, this is all happening really rapidly. And that has implications for food and water security and for migration. So, not to attend to the climate change implications for Middle Eastern politics, I think would be a serious mistake. Apart from that, as Gary was pointing out, there will be some stab at talks with Iran. And what began sort of at the beginning of the campaign season as what appeared to me to be fairly straightforward claims about bringing the United States back into the JCPOA and all that, those claims have now devolved to something more incoherent and more elusive, because the campaign against the JCPOA was so successful in inculcating the impression that the agreement was fatally flawed, that there isn't really the political space, I think, now, for the Democrats simply to re-enter the agreement, which in any case will be much closer to its sunset, clause, or at least some of the propositions in it are sunset and some don't, as you know. So I think that's going to be a complicated issue that will have to be dealt with. On Israel-Palestine, I think there'll be some interesting dynamics. Whether the establishment of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem is complemented, as it were, by the reestablishment of a kind of U.S. mission to the Palestinians, also located in Jerusalem, along the lines that had been the case before. that might be looking at something like that. Possibly a serious fight over annexation. There'll be challenges, there. And there's an evolving relationship, not just with Israel, but also with Saudi Arabia. That will be challenging, I think, for the next administration. And then, then there's the problem of, Turkish intervention in the region. I think people are going to have to grapple with that. I mean, now you have Erdogan, at the same time as he's talking about, the Turkish right to a nuclear weapons capability, is talking about a combined Turkish-Arab army to encircle Israel and invade it. Okay? Now, so maybe this is politicking or, whatever it is, but this, in the framework of NATO politics on the one hand and regional dynamics on the other, is a serious potential problem that might face the next administration. So I put Turkey on that list.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sorry. Well, still plenty of things to talk about as we look forward to the elections. And maybe you'll join us again next year to catch us up on all that. But in the meantime, thank you.
It's automatic.
No, of course you can. I'm sorry, I couldn't call you. Yeah.
I just marked it against that rule, so we'll know to judge it from that based on the results.
Watching about the withdrawal and hearing all of the this is what we do, right, at these sort of
Because
my understanding is that and my question is there a reason why it's a bad idea to be advocating that as American policy? Because it seems to me like when I ask what could a person do about this, it seems like the answer is to create things in America to pressure American leaders to adopt some kind of long-term goal of British autonomy or statehood. Is that a bad idea?
Well, I think if Americans care about it enough, then there will be that.
Those are one of my favorite organizations. Every single one of my students wanted me to keep it.
It's just not really a big issue for the United States, and it's mostly, from a policy perspective, it wouldn't be seen in Washington as a great idea.
So that's
Because people think that, the integrity of the territorial integrity of states is really important to stability. Which is why, the Kurdish state has important influence in Iraq. They're very messy. Because, if you're a status quo power, there's a state system, there are borders.
Well, if no one
Don't mess with them.
Yes.
It's been,
And now I'm
the
just like so
Kurds.
disturbed by this. Okay, good. Don't go anywhere. The world would be a worse place than we did this.
No new states, sorry, Israel.
and it would be a bad idea. Would it be a bad idea to try to adopt the Zionist model as an example and say the U.S. ought to view with favor the establishment of a national home for Kurds? Would that, if that policy were enacted, would that do something bad, or is it just that there aren't decisive reasons politically to advocate for it?
Well, okay. In terms of, bad or good, it's a normative sense.
Sure. Would it cause some great crisis if such a state was
Well, no,
established?
normative sense, should there be a crisis? And on that, I have, no views, I don't care. But but obviously some people.
Thank
do
you,
take
that was
rid of,
very
Thank you for
you know,
coming.
just say there should be,
I'm,
you know, a Kurdish
hi, I'm
stay.
Susan Zeiger, we.
Wait, what?
No, it's okay, I know, cookies, hi.
Hi.
Jew,
Hi, I
live in
work
America.
with K-12 teachers.
Oh,
Fine
really?
with that.
In a nonprofit organization called Primary
A
Source.
Kurd lives in
I've heard of
Syria,
it.
you just want to be fine with that.
In fact, I think we've
Between,
participated.
Yes,
you know,
we've
Kurds
done
and Jews
some
in this
programming
respect.
together.
Oh, sure. I
The
mean,
Jews
and
demanded a state, they got a state.
yeah, but that was because
So I'm the new director.
Well, you're the new director of the council.
I would love to,
It
do what we
didn't
can to
come
support you,
about.
so let me know.
Israeli statehood
We have some
didn't come
younger
about as
scholars,
some
and I
deus
think
ex
they can
machina.
relate much better
You
to
know, it didn't come about
high school
by
kids than
the
old guys like
decree of
me.
the United
So if
States
you
or
want,
any other
That's
country.
great.
somebody
Although
from
Balfour
Turkey or
helped,
Iran.
right?
I do all the time.
Read the
Get
Balfour
outside.
Declaration and tell me
I know when I was in
what
high school, I would love to hear from
Read the Balfour
A national home, not a state.
talking
No,
about
it
their
says
country. or-
Britain looks with favor upon
Let
the
me know.
establishment of a national homeland,
What's your name again,
you
Susan?
know,
Susan Zeiger.
Susan Zeiger.
for the Jews, which promises exactly
Yeah, I'm not
nothing,
gonna-
and it only
We
became
had, we
issue
have got math
when
project last
immigration
year for
Yeah.
a podcast series that
quotas
we did
became
that's
an
been really
issue.
successful.
You know, when,
We have,
you know, the British
year or
became
two,
look at the
we
emergence
have
no,
That's great, thank you. No, in fact, I was told that they had
and then they tried to hedge.
portion organization, so I really like to keep that up.
Good, well,
Thank you.
So,
Yeah,
Thanks for coming.
really a nice
You know,
opportunity to put that up there. It's grim, but it's.
Okay, fine. That to me seems like, and I think that's why, like, as just like a lay Jew in America, that's why the issue seems resonant to me. Because it feels like an analogous.
It does have that, I think you're right about that, it has that, it does
Yeah.
have that
Take care.
analogous feel.
And the Turkish example feels very much like, oh, this is just as the U.S. didn't, just as powers didn't solidify the Yishuv in Palestine before
But
the Holocaust
Israelis-
happened and immigration
The
was prevented.
The Zionists were facing relatively weak enemies. The Kurds face very strong enemies.
Yes.
And, you know, that's, you know, sort of a military balance.
My guess is.
That's, I just think it's not within the ability of the Kurds, you know, to surmount.